You may be seated. Thank you. Further evidence or testimony on behalf of the state of Iowa?
Yes, Your Honor. The state calls John Kraemer.
Sir, if you'll come forward. I'll get you to raise your right hand for me, please. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please be seated. I'm going to ask that you sit right up to and speak right into that microphone and start by stating your full name. Spell your last name for us, please.
Sure. My name is John Kraemer. Last name is spelled Kraemer.
Counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, what do you do for a living?
Currently, I'm the chief of the training bureau for the Iowa State Fire Marshal's Office.
In June of 2015, how were you employed?
During that time, I was the director of forensics for the State Medical Examiner's Office in Ankeny.
And, sir, can you speak directly into that mic so we can all hear you?
Sure.
Thank you. And what were your duties and responsibilities in your position at the State Medical Examiner's Office?
They were many-fold. I was the administrator for the office, so I worked very closely with our chief state medical examiner at the time with administrative functions of the office, such as hiring personnel, payroll, working on legislative issues with our office, and also I did provide training to our county medical examiners across the state in death investigation principles, and I also assisted with death investigations.
And when you assisted in death investigations, did that include assisting in autopsies?
Yes, it did.
Let me back up for just a little bit. Can you tell us about your formal education and training?
Yes. I have a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities, and I also have a Master's of Health Science degree from Quinnipiac University in Hamden, Connecticut. I'm trained as a physician assistant in the field of pathology, or was otherwise known as a pathologist assistant.
And sir, do you hold any professional licenses or certifications?
I do. I'm board certified by the American Society of Clinical Pathologists as a PA in pathology. I'm also board certified by the American Board of Medical Legal Death Investigators as a death investigator. And I also hold multiple certifications in fire and EMS.
Sir, what does board certified mean?
Board certification means that you have demonstrated through written exam and also through practical examination or hands-on skill sets, competency in your field of your professional field.
Now, did you assist in the autopsy of Shirley Carter?
I did.
And what was your role in that autopsy?
On that day, my role primarily involved with assisting with the collection, preservation, storage, and transfer of evidence that was collected during the autopsy.
Now, were photographs taken during that autopsy?
Multiple photographs were taken, yes.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Sir, I'm handing you what's been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit 115, 116, and 120. Can you take a look at those? And what are those?
What you have handed me are photographs that were taken at the time of Ms. Carter's autopsy.
And what does photograph 115 depict? Or Exhibit 115, I'm sorry.
Sure. Exhibit 115 shows a gunshot wound of Ms. Carter.
And what does Exhibit 116 depict?
That also displays a gunshot wound, actually a couple gunshot wounds of Ms. Carter.
And Exhibit 120?
Exhibit 120 displays a fragment of a projectile that was recovered from Ms. Carter's autopsy, or body, excuse me.
Do those photographs fairly and accurately represent what you observed during the autopsy of Shirley Carter?
Yes, they do.
State would offer Exhibits 115, 116, and 117.
No objection.
Did you mean 117, or
Nope,
did you mean 120?
120, Your Honor, thank you.
All right. Exhibits 115, 116, and 120 are admitted.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness again?
You may.
Now, were x-rays also performed during this autopsy?
Multiple x-rays were taken, yes.
And handing you has been marked for identification purposes. It states Exhibit 119. Can you tell us what that is?
Sure, Exhibit 119 shows a radiograph or a chest x-ray that was taken of the decedent at the time of autopsy.
Does that truly and accurately reflect the x-ray of Shirley Carter?
Yes, it does.
State offers Exhibit 119, Your Honor.
No objection.
Exhibit 119 is admitted.
Your Honor, may I publish Exhibit 120 and 119 to the jury?
You may.
Thank you, Your Honor. For the record, this is Exhibit 120. What are we looking at here, sir?
That photograph demonstrates a fragment of a projectile that was recovered from the body of Shirley Carter.
And where was that fragment recovered from?
That fragment was recovered within the soft tissues of, I believe, Ms. Carter's left axillary or left armpit area.
Now, for the record, this is Exhibit 119. Can you tell us what we're looking at in this photo?
Yes, that is the photograph showing the chest x-ray that was taken of Ms. Carter at autopsy. It also demonstrates multiple projectile fragments within Ms. Carter's body, including that aforementioned copper jacketed fragment that you saw in the previous photograph.
And can you describe for the jury where that fragment is located in this photo?
Sure. When you're looking at that particular photograph, you have to look at it in terms of us viewing the patient. And so the patient is actually laying supine on a table. So the left arm or armpit area to your right is actually the patient's left arm. And that large radio opaque or lighted area on the x-ray is what's consistent with the picture of the copper jacket fragment that you saw in the previous photograph.
Your Honor, could we take a short break and see if we can fix the microphone issue?
Lori, do we have batteries?
Sure do, sir.
Sometimes it works really well, and sometimes it doesn't work at all. Yes.
Testing.
Testing. Testing. Testing.
You really have to talk right into it. You may proceed, Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, in your role in Shirley Carter's autopsy, did you also collect items of evidentiary value?
Yes, I did.
What were those items?
There were two types of evidence that were collected during the exam. One is physical evidence, the other is biological evidence. And so blood, urine, and fluid from the eyes were collected as biological samples, in addition to a blood stain card, which is a DNA standard. We also collected fingernail clippings, We also collected hair from the decedent. We collected major case prints, which are very detailed prints of both of the decedent's hands. And we also collected the decedent's clothing, in addition to the fragments of the projectiles that were found in and on Ms. Carter.
Were those bullet fragments submitted to the DCI crime lab?
They were.
Were Shirley Carter's major case prints submitted to the DCI crime lab?
Yes, they were.
And was Shirley Carter's clothing submitted to the DCI crime lab?
Those were submitted to the lab as well.
Now, prior to this autopsy, had you assisted in other autopsies?
Yes, I've participated in over 3,000 autopsies in my 25-year career.
Have you also conducted autopsies?
I have. As a PA, I was allowed with my scope of practice to perform autopsies under the supervision of a pathologist in a hospital setting.
Did you observe anything out of the ordinary in how Shirley Carter's autopsy was performed?
I did not observe anything out of the ordinary. The autopsy is performed in a systematic, standardized approach. And so during Ms. Carter's autopsy, there was nothing abnormal as to how it was conducted.
And have you reviewed the autopsy report that was created?
Yes, I have.
Is there anything in that autopsy report that you felt was inconsistent with what you observed during the autopsy?
I found no inconsistencies.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination?
May I approach the witness?
You may.
I'm handing you an item that has been marked as Defendant's Exhibit M. What is that?
A defense exhibit M is a photograph that shows the decedent's nose looking up into the nostrils, and within the right nares, or the white nostril of the decedent, appears to be fly eggs.
And what is the size of that fly egg bloom?
Just estimating and using the ruler that's in the photograph, probably just a tad smaller than 1/4 of an inch.
I have no further questions.
Redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Thanks, sir. You may step down. May this witness be excused.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
You are excused, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Further evidence or testimony on behalf of the state?
Yes, Your Honor. The state would call Dr. Jonathan Thompson.
Good afternoon. I can get you to raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please be seated.
Thank you.
Doctor, that microphone may or may not work. Try to use it if you can. If you would, please state your full name for the record, spell your last name.
My name is Jonathan Thompson, and my last name is spelled Thompson.
Counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, what do you do for a living?
I'm the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Iowa.
And what are your duties and responsibilities in that role?
As a Deputy Chief, I assist with administrative duties. That includes hiring of personnel and training of personnel. I also assist with setting policies for the State Medical Examiner's Office. I assist with legislators interpreting and writing laws. I assist with the budget. And then as a medical examiner, my primary duties are to determine cause and manner of death. cause of death would be why the person died. That could include things like gunshot wound, stab wound, drug overdose, and then manner of death would be the circumstances surrounding the death. And in Iowa, there's 5 manners of death: natural, accident, suicide, homicide, and undetermined.
And I guess I should have asked this earlier, but are you a forensic pathologist?
Yes, sir.
And how long have you been a forensic pathologist?
I became a board-certified forensic pathologist in 2007, so going on 12 years now.
Has all that experience been with the state medical examiner's office, or the Iowa State Medical Examiner's office?
After I finished my fellowship, which I did at the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's office in Minneapolis, Minnesota, I stayed on there as a staff physician from July of 2007 until December of 2008. And then I'm a native Iowan, so I came back to Iowa in December of 2008. So I've been at the state office since December of 2008.
Can you tell us about your educational background?
I received a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Iowa. I received that in 1998. Following undergrad, I then did medical school, so I am a licensed physician. I also did that at the University of Iowa. I have a medical degree, which I received in 2002. Following medical school, I did something called residency, which is basically on-the-job training in medicine. I did that in the field of medicine called pathology. I did that at the University of Minnesota from 2002 until 2006. And then following my 4-year residency in pathology, I did a 1-year subspecialty training in a field of pathology called forensic pathology. And I did that at the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's office in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Do you continue to attend ongoing training and education?
Yes.
I want to start with just some basic information about the medical examiner's office. When an individual is brought to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy, is that autopsy generally performed immediately?
No.
What happens when the body arrives?
When the body arrives at our office, the body is considered evidence, and so we have to maintain that chain of custody for the evidence. And so when the body arrives, we write it into our body received logbook. We write who the body is received from, the date the body was received, and then the time the body was received. The body then goes into a body cooler that's set around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and that helps to prevent decompositional changes in the body. And then usually that body will stay in that body cooler up until the time of the autopsy, which is usually the next day. So the body is not autopsied immediately upon receipt of the body.
How quickly does the body get placed in the body cooler?
I would say just minutes. It's simply a matter of writing the decedent's name, the time the body was received, the date the body was received, and then who received the body in a logbook, and then the body goes into the cooler.
When, in preparation for an autopsy, when is the body removed from the body cooler?
It would be on the morning. We perform our autopsies in the morning. They usually start on 9 during weekdays, a little bit earlier on weekends, but it's usually received maybe 45 minutes to an hour prior to the start of the autopsy. The body's brought out, and then paperwork for that autopsy is filled out by our autopsy techs.
What's kind of the first step when you're doing an autopsy?
Well, the first step would be to make sure that the person you think you're doing the autopsy on is actually the person, so just verifying the identification of that person. And then after that, then the next step would be kind of a general overview of the external examination. That's where we look at the outside of the body. We'll document things like what type of clothing they were wearing, any type of personal effects, and then any type of medical intervention that may be on the body. Following that, depending on what type of case it is, we might collect DNA. So any potential homicide case, we always like to get fingernail clippings for potential perpetrators' DNA underneath the fingernail clippings. We'll do pulled scalp hair. And then after the collecting of DNA, then we will remove all the clothing, and then we will look at the outside of the skin. So kind of continue with our external examination. During the external examination, we look at things like height, weight, hair color, eye color, any type of scars or any type of tattoos that person might have, and then obviously any external injuries present on the body. We will document those injuries using simple diagrams, so we just write in a pen what the injury looks like, and then for the most part we usually photograph those injuries also. Following the external examination, we then proceed to the internal examination where we will collect blood for toxicology testing. We then also look at the inside of the body for any traumatic injuries, and then also look at the organs for any type of natural disease processes, things like heart disease, liver disease, brain disease, etc. And then the final part of the autopsy is toxicology, which is drug and alcohol studies.
Are photos taken during the autopsy?
Yes,
Are x-rays taken during the autopsy?
sometimes.
How do you decide when x-rays are taken or not?
We'll take x-rays for all gunshot wound cases, not only homicide gunshot wound cases, but self-inflicted gunshot wound cases. We'll do x-rays for stab wounds. We'll do x-rays for infants. We're looking for bony fractures, which could be signs of abuse. So for the gunshot wound cases, the reason why we do x-rays is because we want to see if there's bullets or bullet fragments inside of the body. We'll go in during the autopsy and recover those bullets or bullet fragments and then turn them over to ballistic experts, bullet experts, and they sometimes are able to determine what type of gun was used and maybe even determine exactly what gun was used. In the case of stab wounds, we x-ray the area of the body injured because sometimes a portion of the knife might break off and still be inside of the body.
Once the autopsy is completed, what happens to the body?
After the autopsy is completed, if the pathologist, if the physician is completely done with their examination and there's no other evidence that needs to be collected, the pathologist will sign the consent, the okay to release form, which basically tells that the autopsy technicians and the ancillary staff that the body can be released back to the funeral home. The body is taken from the autopsy suite into the body cooler, and then usually either an autopsy tech or a medical examiner investigator will call the funeral home and tell the funeral director that the body can be picked up from our office.
Does the state medical examiner's office maintain a case file on every autopsy that's performed?
Yes.
Does that file include all the photographs that are taken?
Yes.
Any x-rays that are taken?
The x-rays are kept on a server. They would not be in the file, but every single x-ray that's been taken at the state medical examiner's office we have.
Would the case file also include the preliminary report of investigation from the county medical examiner or medical examiner investigator?
Yes.
When an autopsy is performed, is a report written?
Yes.
Who writes that report?
That's dictated by the pathologist. They dictate it into a dictaphone, and then that report is then transcribed by one of our secretaries.
What information is included in an autopsy report?
Basically, the autopsy report includes everything the pathologist saw during the autopsy. That would it also includes the decedent's name. It includes who the investigator is. The first page is usually just an outline, kind of summarizing everything that was seen during the autopsy. And then the autopsy report begins with that external examination, documenting things like height, weight, hair color, eye color, any types of scars, tattoos, medical intervention. Within the autopsy report is also an evidence of injury section where we dictate any type of injuries present on the body, either externally or internally. And then the last half of the autopsy is the internal examination, which is internal examination for only natural disease processes.
Do forensic pathologists use specialized language in their autopsy reports?
We use medical language, which to some people it might seem foreign or specialized, but it's just a medical record, just like your primary care physician records are. So, we'll use words like anterior, posterior, lateral, laceration. So they're just medical words.
And do you use medical terminology so that other forensic pathologists can understand what is contained in the report?
Yes.
Have you reviewed autopsy reports written by other forensic pathologists?
Yes.
And when you do that, are you able to understand their recorded observations?
Yes.
Does the autopsy report also go in the case file?
Yes.
Now, I want to turn specifically to the autopsy of Shirley Carter. When did Shirley Carter's body arrive at the medical examiner's office?
It arrived the day prior to her autopsy. The body arrived June 19th, 2015.
And was she placed in the body cooler when she arrived?
Yes.
When did the autopsy of Shirley Carter actually begin?
And I'm just going to refer to the autopsy notes. Is that okay?
Go ahead.
I'll make sure I state the page when I refer to it. So this is on page 1 of 7 at the very top. It says date/time : Mrs. Carter's autopsy began at 8:45 a.m. on June 20th of 2015. I believe that was a Saturday.
And you mentioned earlier that you'll document the height and weight of the individual being autopsied. What was Shirley Carter's height and weight?
She was 5 feet 2 inches tall and 125 pounds.
Who performed the autopsy of Shirley Carter?
The autopsy was performed by Dr. Julia Gooden. Dr. Gooden was the chief medical examiner. She has recently left the state of Iowa and is the state medical examiner for Tennessee.
Now, were photographs taken during Shirley Carter's autopsy?
Yes.
And were x-rays taken?
Yes.
Have you reviewed Dr. Gooden's report, the photographs, and the x-rays?
Yes.
Does the report contain a description of the injuries to Shirley Carter?
Yes, it does.
And what are those injuries?
Mrs. Carter sustained 2 gunshot wound injuries of the chest. One entered on the front of the chest and then exited out of the top left chest area. The second gunshot wound entered on the right side of the chest and then exited out of the left side of the chest.
Now, I want to start with the gunshot wound that is described in the report as the gunshot wound of right back. Where did this gunshot enter Shirley Carter's body?
Dr. Gooden describes it as the entrance on the right mid-back inferior to the axilla. That's A-X-I-L-L-A. The axilla is essentially the armpit region, so it's just below the armpit region on the right.
Your Honor, may I publish Exhibits 115 and 116?
You may.
Thank you, Your Honor. this the wound you were just referring to, Doc?
Yes, it is.
Did this gunshot wound have an exit,
Yes, it did.
and where did it exit?
It exited in the left axillary region, which is the left armpit region.
And for the record, this is Exhibit 116. Does this depict that exit wound?
Yes, it does.
Based on the entrance and exit wounds associated with that gunshot, can you determine a trajectory for that shot?
I'd have to review the autopsy notes. And when I talk about trajectory, the only thing I can talk about is the pathway of the bullet through the body. I can't tell the pathway of the bullet through the air prior to hitting Mrs. Carter. So the trajectory, according to Dr. Gooden's notes, was from Mrs. Carter's back to front, and then from Mrs. Carter's right to left. So it just went from her right to left and then slightly forward.
Can you describe for the jury the internal damage caused by that bullet?
Partially. The difficult thing is there's also a gunshot wound of the chest, of the front of the chest, and that gunshot wound of the chest causes injury basically to the same organs as the gunshot wound to the right side of the chest. So it's a little bit difficult to separate them out as far as which caused which type of injury.
Then I guess let me do this first then, Doctor. The second gunshot you referred to, where did that gunshot enter Shirley Carter's body?
It entered Mrs. Carter's body on the midline front of the chest, which is basically just on top of the breastbone, which is called the sternum. So just front of the chest.
And did that gunshot exit her body?
Yes, it did.
Where?
It exited her body on the top left of the chest, just at the base of the neck.
And again, if you could just provide an idea of the trajectory of the bullet path.
Yeah. According to Dr. Gooden, the bullet pathway was upwards, so was going towards her head, and then slightly front to back.
Now, can you describe for the jury the internal damage caused by both of these bullets?
Yes. Both bullets involved organs and bones of the chest only. There was no injuries to the abdomen. When the bullet of the front of the chest went through the sternum or the breastbone, it caused a fracture of that bone, and it caused a what Dr. Gooden describes as a hole measuring 5 by 2.7 inches in length and width. After it passed through the sternum, the bullet passed through the heart and the sac that surrounds the heart. That's called the pericardial sac. And this is in quotes. Dr. Gooden describes it as, quote, almost completely shredding and destroying the heart and pericardial sac, period, into quotes. That description of completely shredding is significant because it suggests that the type of weapon used to kill Mrs. Carter was a rifle round from a rifle that was traveling at a high velocity. So a rifle round travels at a very high velocity, sometimes several thousand feet per second. And as a result of that, it has lots of energy. And so when it hits tissue, it shares that energy with the surrounding tissue and it shreds it, just like Dr. Gooden describes. If it was a handgun round, like a revolver or a pistol, those travel at much slower velocity than a rifle round, and they tend to just punch a hole in the organ it hit. So the fact that Dr. Gooden describes the heart as being shredded suggests that it's a a rifle round that she was hit by. Both bullets hit the heart. They both do injuries to the right and left lungs. The bullet pathway, or the bullet injury that entered on her right, also hit the aorta, which is the major vessel that takes blood away from the heart and gives blood to the rest of the body. And then you also had some fractures of ribs on both the right and left side associated with the gunshot wound entrance on the right. And then there was also a fracture of the clavicle and first rib associated with the gunshot wound of the front of the chest.
Now, you stated that you also reviewed the x-rays, is that correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I retrieve Exhibit 119 and show it to the jury?
You may.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you describe what you observed in this x-ray?
This is an x-ray of Mrs. Carter's chest taken prior to the start of the autopsy. Again, we x-ray gunshot wounds because we want to see if there are bullets or bullet fragments inside the body, and then we'll go in and attempt to recover them. So when x-rays are taken, they're taken as if the person is looking at you. So the left of Mrs. Carter would be on the right of the screen, and her right side of the body would be on the left of the screen. So everything in white is bone. So we're just looking at the chest, and you can see the spine running right down the middle of that x-ray, and then ribs coming off of that spine. You'll notice that there's some very small, what I call metallic density objects, which are very small white objects which extend from kind of the middle of the chest up to the top right of the screen, which would be her top left shoulder. That's the wound pathway of the bullet that entered the front of the chest. That x-ray is also diagnostic of a rifle round traveling at a high velocity. A rifle round, if it's not a full metal jacket, so if it's like a hollow point or a partially jacketed projectile or a soft point, when it hits tissue, it starts to break apart and leaves those itty-bitty metal fragments along the wound pathway. That's called a lead snowstorm, and that is diagnostic of a rifle round traveling at high velocity. You'll also see in the kind of the left armpit region, so on the right of the screen, is a larger kind of a irregular, kind of curvy white object. That is a larger piece of bullet that was recovered from Mrs. Carter's left armpit area during the autopsy. And then also kind of in that left armpit region and even on the left arm are some small metallic density objects, so small white pieces. Those are also bullet fragments that broke off from the other gunshot wound that entered on the right side of the chest.
Are the descriptions of the gunshots in the autopsy report consistent with the photos and the x-rays that you reviewed?
Yes.
Doctor, based on your education, training, and experience, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of forensic medical certainty as to the cause of death of Shirley Carter?
Yes, I do.
What is that opinion?
She died from multiple gunshot wounds.
And do you also, based on your education, training, and experience, have an opinion to a reasonable degree of forensic medical certainty as to the manner of death?
Yes, I do.
And what is that opinion?
The manner of death was homicide.
Now, I want to change gears a little bit with you, Doctor. Does this autopsy report make any reference to time of death?
No.
Is there anything in the autopsy report that would allow you to make a determination as to time of death?
No.
generally speaking, are there observations, medical observations that can be made that can assist in determining time of death?
At the time of autopsy,
Let's just generally, not necessarily autopsy, but are there certain observations that could assist?
yes,
Would that include Reiger Mortis,
yes,
Reiger Mortis,
yes,
Elger Mortis?
yes.
And can you explain that last one to the jury?
Yeah, Reiger Mortis is the cooling of the body after death. So after you die, you lose the ability to generate heat and maintain that normal body temperature. And so your body temperature starts to change and will approximate the environmental temperature over some extended period of time. So it's just a change of your body temperature to meet the environmental temperature.
And can you also describe for the jury what Reiger Mortis is?
Reiger Mortis is the settling of blood to the dependent portions of the body. So red blood cells have mass, so they have a weight, and they are pulled to the earth just like everything else that has mass. So if you are found on your back, those red blood cells are pulled towards your back. So Reiger Mortis is the settling of blood to the dependent portions of the body, and that's because of the pull of the gravity of the earth on those red blood cells.
And can you briefly describe for the jury what Reiger Mortis is?
Yeah, Reiger Mortis is simply the stiffening of muscles after death, so your body becomes rigid, and that's due to the loss of energy, what's called ATP. Energy is actually required to relax the muscles. And so after death, you no longer can make energy, and so your muscles become rigid for a period of time.
Now, I think you started to answer this question, but by the time the body gets to autopsy, are any of those observations useful in determining time of death?
No.
Why not?
Most of the time when we do an autopsy examination, the person has already been dead for 24 hours. So most people are stiff. Reiger Mortis, after around 12 hours, will become fixed. So that means when you press your finger on that areas of lividity, it doesn't blanch, so you can't see your finger impression. And then the body, after we receive it, goes into the body cooler, and so everybody that we examine is cool. So everybody's stiff, everybody has fixed lividity, and everybody's cool, just because of the length of time from examination out until we perform our autopsy.
Now, the jury has heard some testimony concerning taking the temperature of a decedent. Does the state medical examiner's office recommend that county medical examiners or medical examiner investigators take liver temperatures of decedents?
No.
Why not?
One of the reasons is it creates artifactual injury. If you want to take a liver temperature, what you have to do is you have to make a little cut in the upper abdomen area. You then have to take a probe and probe it into the liver, and that helps to give an idea of what's called the core body temperature is. So the problem with that is you create an injury to the skin, and then you also create an injury to the liver. That's one of the reasons why we don't like the county medical examiners to do a liver temperature.
And is that true in all cases? I mean, are there any cases that a county medical examiner would respond to where you wouldn't be concerned about additional injuries?
You know, if there's a case of something called excited delirium syndrome, where the person's body temperature is incredibly high, then sometimes we like to have things like a rectal temperature, or maybe just feeling the body to see if it's warm. But for the most part, we have never suggested or recommended taking anybody's liver core temperature, no matter what type of case it is.
Now, the jury has heard some testimony about fly eggs in Mrs. Carter's nostril. As a forensic pathologist, is the presence of fly eggs in a decedent's nostril particularly meaningful?
Not really. It tells us there's flies, obviously, in the environment. But as far as nailing down the time of death, to me, it's not that useful. You get especially when the window of death is so short, the best way to determine time of death is good scene investigation. When were they last seen?
Objection, Your Honor, I believe that this may be outside this witness's scope of expertise when he's talking about scene investigation.
Why don't you ask another question, if you would, please, counsel?
In your experience, doctor, what is the best way to determine time of death?
Scene investigation.
And what does that mean?
Scene investigation involves knowing when they were last seen alive, and then finding out when they were found dead, and then that's what's called your window of death. So you know with absolute certainty that that person died sometime when they were last seen alive and when they were found. And then you can try to narrow that window down through things like Reiger Mortis, rigidity, Reiger Mortis, settling of blood, Reiger Mortis, cooling of the body. Nowadays, everybody's texting. So when was the last time they texted on their...
Objection, I think that we're, again, past the scope of expertise.
Why don't you ask another question, Mr. Robinson?
Yes, Your Honor. Doctor, getting back to the fly eggs, when might they be useful?
Your Honor, may I forward the witness for the purpose of forming an objection?
You may.
Do you have any training in forensic entomology?
We have some training during our fellowship.
Would it be fair to say that you're not an expert in forensic entomology?
I would agree with that. There's a lot of math equations, a lot of temperature variations, humidity, what type of insect laid the eggs. All those go into, if you're trying to determine time of death with bugs, all those play a factor in trying to estimate time of death.
And those are all things that are evaluated by a forensic entomologist, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, I'd object to any further testimony by this witness.
Sustained.
Doctor, I understand that you're not a board-certified forensic entomologist, but how, as a forensic pathologist, how do you use fly eggs?
Well, I've personally never used fly eggs. I know some.
Objection to any testimony after that.
Sustained.
Your Honor, may I approach and get a couple of exhibits to show the witness?
You may.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm handing you exhibits 40 and 42. You can take a look at those. And I'd like you to specifically look at the arms in those photos. May I show the exhibits to the jury, Your Honor?
You may.
Exhibit 40 and exhibit 42. As you look at those photos, can you make any determination as to the presence or level of Reiger Mortis?
No. In order to determine if a body's rigid, you have to move the body part. So just by looking at it, you can't tell if the body's rigid.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Dr. Thompson, you gave a deposition on March 8th of this year, is that correct?
Yes.
At that time, you provided a number of different temperatures at which the body was stored, moved. Have you reviewed those temperatures?
Not since the deposition.
Do you have any changes in any of the temperatures you provided?
No, ma'am.
Have you also advised county medical examiners not to take a rectal temperature
Yes.
and not to take a temporal temperature?
Yes.
You have in front of you an item, Exhibit M. Do you see that in front of you? It's a photograph of a nostril.
Yes, I do.
And is that the photograph of the egg clutch that was found in the decedent's nostril?
Yes.
What's the approximate size of that egg clutch?
According to the ruler in the photograph, it's about 0.5 by 0.6 centimeters.
To your knowledge, that egg clutch was not preserved.
That's to my knowledge, yes. There's nothing mentioned about it in the autopsy report.
No further questions.
Redirect.
Briefly, Your Honor. Why do you not recommend a rectal temperature be taken?
A few reasons. Just it's similar to liver temperature. You risk the possibility of introducing injury. In this case, it would be rectal injury, which would be concerning for some type of sexual assault. The other, just kind of the other thing about temperature in general is that it's very difficult to kind of interpret what it means. So on the average, the body cools about 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit per hour at room temperature. The problem is that there's a lot of variation on the temperature that you start off with. Starting with how you measure that temperature. If you take a rectal temperature, that temperature would be different than an ear temperature, a tympanic temperature, which would be different from a forehead temperature, which would be different from an oral temperature, which is different from an armpit temperature. There's also variation between people. There's also within the same person there can be variation. Our body temperatures naturally decrease during sleep. It tends to be lowest around 4 a.m. to 6 a.m., and it tends to be highest in the afternoon around 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. After we eat, our body temperature might slightly increase. After exercise, our body temperature can significantly increase. If we're sick, our body temperatures can go up. That's called a fever. So the problem is that the initial starting point of trying to interpret how long the person's been dead is difficult. And then trying to determine that slope of how fast you cool off is also challenging. It depends on the environmental temperature. If you die outside in the wintertime in Minneapolis, you're going to cool off a lot faster than if you died in Florida during the summertime, where your core body temperature might actually increase. It depends on the body habitus of the person. If you have a lot of fat, you stay warmer longer because it acts as an insulator. Women tend to cool off a little bit faster because they have a higher surface area to body mass ratio. If you're wearing clothing, that helps to keep you warm. If you have, if you're laying on some type of floor that's cool, you lose heat through conduction, so you cool off faster. If there's a cool breeze blowing by you, like if the window's open or the door's open, you lose heat through convection. So there's just so many variables into the equation. You basically need an equation for every single person that dies. So it's just very challenging. So that's why we don't recommend taking any type of body temperature at the scene.
No further questions, thank you.
Anything further, Ms. Branstad?
And I just want to clarify two things. One, that photograph was taken at 11:35:37, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And second, it isn't just that you don't recommend, you have a policy against taking temperature of tympanic rectal or liver stick temperature of the decedents, is that correct?
I don't know if we have a policy. We just don't recommend it to the counties.
So if the county medical examiner said, you know, there's a policy against it, would that, do you think that would be a fair interpretation by the county medical examiner when you say, do you think that would be a fair interpretation?
Yes.
No further questions.
Anything further?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir. You may
All right.
step down.
Thank you.
May this witness be excused.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Branstad?
Yes, Your Honor.
Very well. You may step down.